All right, so this is the conversation I had with my good friend Hollie Mckay. Hollie is a veteran war journalist who has covered a variety of conflicts abroad, including the rise of ISIS in Syria. Most recently, she came back from a trip that took her to the borders between Chad and Sudan, where she got to experience the life that a lot of the Sudanese people are going through at this stage. In addition to that, she launched two very interesting things recently. One is a novel called The Dictator's Wife, and the other is a podcast that's called Dispatches from Parenting Across Cultures. So, if you're interested in hearing our conversation, perhaps you'd want to stick around. We delve into a lot of interesting topics, particularly the um, the reality of war reporting and what that entails. So, without further ado, this is our conversation together. All right, I think we are live, Hollie. Thank you for joining me in the East Wing. It's honestly a pleasure to have you again with me in this virtual studio, and I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to be having.
Me too.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot has happened recently in the world and in your life, right? I mean, your recent trips to I think Chad or even the border with Sudan, right, to highlight the plight of what people in Sudan are going through, and obviously recently you started a new podcast, and congratulations. That's that's great. And I mean, there's a lot happening, and obviously the collapse of the Syrian regime, a country where I'm sure you've had a great deal of experience with being, I guess, on the ground. Um, I'm interested to before we even talk about the collapse and this sort of maybe I guess major transition in the Middle East. How about we sort of maybe go back to the time you were there in Syria? I think it was 2015, right? Um,
I've made a few trips to Syria, sort of, yeah, around that period. I think the last time I was there was 2018.
oh wow, yeah,
Might have been 2019, but around then, yeah.
good
But
lord.
but I sort of started going. Um, I think it was around 2013 was my first time there.
2013. So, can you maybe just a little bit of context, walk us through a little bit of your time there, the first trip? What was that like? I mean, it's been I think now more than 10 years since you've first stepped foot in Syria. What was the reality on the ground like during that time?
I mean, it was a heart. I mean, really just a heartbreaking war. I think how quickly everything had escalated from a peaceful protest into just an absolute brutal crackdown by a dictatorial government, and just just the level of fear people had, the enormity of the bombing campaign, which really increased with Russia's involvement in 2015, um, and just the lives that people live in war. And I think that is the universal aspect of war, no matter what sort of country you're in. It's people are living day by day in absolute fear. Every other sort of institution falls away. There's no 911 to call. There's no um, hospital to kind of go to if you're sort of sick and not feeling well, because they are already so overwhelmed. And in the case of Syria, really a target for these bombing campaigns. So it's just, an incredibly sad and depressing situation of how lives are completely upended really in an instant. Um, and that, you can walk outside your house, and not even walk outside your house. You can be asleep in your bed
Right.
and a bomb will hit. The unpredictability of it, it's exhausting. That living in that type of fear is it's so depleting on the body.
Mm.
I can't imagine having to have existed in that 24/7.
Yeah. And you were there for how long, Holly? Do you remember?
My trips were usually like a few weeks on end, so
Yeah.
2, 3, up to a month.
And the first time you were there, um, do you recall, I guess, the cities or the areas where you were that you visited or maybe reported from?
Yeah, it was sort of initially was from the Turkish side, so you're looking at more Idlib, through Aleppo, that area. And then other trips, depending on the focus of what I was working on, I would go through Iraq, the northern part of Iraq, where you get in a little boat and you cross the Euphrates River to the other side, and that's Syria. And then from there I would sort of go all over from Kobani to Manbij to Deir ez-Zor to Raqqa to um, sort of anything, and sort of a different, I guess, part of Aleppo from that side as well. So you kind of, depending on which side you're coming from. So yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
did get a visa to go to Damascus, a very rare visa once to go to Damascus that the regime had given me. But unfortunately, it's a long story. We don't have to go into it. But unfortunately, at the time, I was working for a big news organization and they really didn't give an answer. They just said, nope, you can't go, which
oh,
absolutely broke my heart because I'd worked so hard to get that. And I think when you've been doing this work for a long time, you do develop like a journalist instinct when you know something is going to happen. And so that period that would have been there would have been the first time that I think Trump kind of issued a retaliation bombing against Bashar. So yeah, it was unfortunate
oh,
it wasn't there. I was there on another occasion where that did happen, but yeah, that's the the beauty of now being an independent journalist. I get it, I guess, is that I can make those decisions for myself and not rely on someone behind a desk to tell me what is newsworthy and what's not.
right, right. And that gives you a little bit of freedom to maybe experiment with things or do things that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. I remember last I think last year here at NC State, there was we had a conversation. My department had a conversation with uh, Ambassador, I think Roebuck, William Roebuck. I don't know if that name is familiar to you, but essentially he mentioned that in 2019 he was one of two, I guess, American diplomats who were in Syria, and they were embedded with, I guess, special forces guys, U.S. special forces
Mm.
guys, and I don't really remember. Um,
So he would have been covering the more ISIS side of the equation.
oh, okay, yeah, because his boss
Yeah.
was, I think, his name is James Jeffrey, the former U.S. special envoy
Mm,
to fight against
right.
ISIS. Yeah, and
Right.
I mean, his experience was just, I guess, kind of crazy, and so I wonder if you ever had to be, especially in Syria, to be, if you had to be embedded with certain military units in order to gain access into particular places. Is that something that you had to do for a while?
No, I mean that's some journalists really like doing embeds, and that's something that that's their style of reporting, and I think there's certainly a place for that. That's never really been my style of reporting. I've always wanted independence. I think that when you know you do go on embeds, but and I certainly went with the SDF and other groups out on things, but I did my best to be as sort of independent of that as possible. I had contacts with US, special forces that were there, and I did go to the base and meet with, some different figures there. But they, it was frustrating, honestly, because
Oh,
they wanted everything to be off record, and they kind of wanted to pretend that I that I wasn't even sort of in the area. And I remember at one point being, I don't remember what city I was in, but my fixer and I were somewhere, and I was having lunch with a different sort of they were SDF fighters, and then these two American sort of soldiers kind of came in, and they sort of freaked out and didn't know what to do. So it was
oh,
very bizarre, um,
good Lord.
because I think they have to go through so many channels. But I yeah, it's never been my style of reporting. I've certainly tried to be um as independent from that, as I can, but I do recognize that in certain situations, embeds have value. But I think if you can find access, otherwise, that's usually the approach that I try to take.
Yeah, it's really. I remember the story of what was his name, Bastian or Sebastian Younger, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
filmmaker.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, he did great pieces embedded with, and I mean yeah, he did. That was his style of journalism. He did really a beautiful job with his books and his films,
Right.
taking that style of journalism and telling the story of the American soldier. I think for me, my interest has always been more with the civilian side. I
Mm,
think that um, I don't know. People will be upset with me, but I do think that there is a difference between the way that a woman covers a conflict compared to the way a man covers it. And just from a biological point of view, men typically are always more interested in what we call the bang bang, the
mm,
military side of it. What weapons are being used, how the strategy is coming, which side is doing what. Whereas, at least in my experience, and many of my women colleagues tend to be a little bit more interested in the humanitarian side of it, the hospitals, the funeral homes, the houses, to go and drink tea and get information that way and tell things from maybe a different perspective. And both types of stories are extremely valuable in different ways. But I think for me, I've always had much more of an affinity with that human side of it, maybe more than the military side of it.
Oh, that's really interesting that you touched on that, Holly, because I think even in certain cultures where you had to cover a few stories, maybe the women over there might be reluctant to talk to a guy and might feel a little bit more comfortable talking to a female. So I think, I mean, in that particular situation, it really you offer an outlet for for a particular demographic, particularly women, to actually talk about certain things that they otherwise wouldn't, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that we have access to 100% of the population in many cases, which our male colleagues just don't. And so that's a real asset.
Yeah. And what do you remember from, I guess, some of the stories or one or two things you remember from your trips to Syria? I mean, I'm sure, I mean, you've written a book about it. I mean, you've written about, ISIS, stories about
Yeah.
ISIS. But I mean, one thing that maybe you think you'll never, I guess, forget.
I think it's just the frustration that people felt in that the whole world knew what was happening in Syria and the fact that, we got to this point of almost 14 years into a war,
Yeah.
and it seemed for a long time that Bashar was just going to stay in power. And the fact that somebody can kill that many people and commit such war crimes against his own people, um, that was extremely frustrating for the Syrians. But I think that, in general, they're very warm people, they're very generous people, very
Mm,
hospitable people. And Syrians are not extreme people. There's many different sects, many different minorities, and they've for a long time, coexisted. And I think that, when the war happened, it was very difficult for the US and the West to, I think, initially they supported the opposition, but but after a period of time, it became too hard to support the opposition anymore because it had been co-opted by these extreme elements. So you were in a very frustrating situation of not supporting a dictatorship, but also not supporting an opposition, which at that point it was extremely fractured.
mm,
Um, and it had a lot of good guys, but also a lot of bad. And so I think, for Syrians themselves, they were very conflicted in how to turn to, but general consensus that I've received then that has never changed, that continued when I spoke to a lot of my Syrian friends this past weekend, um, is really that, HTS or any of these groups, they might not be good, but anything is better than the Assad regime.
No. And I think that's a similar rhetoric that we, I guess, even in Libya, I remember at the time, is a similar rhetoric that was advanced by many, I guess, uh, many different parts of Libya, whether it be, Benghazi or Tripoli. There was this, this
Mm.
sentiment where, anything is better than a dictatorship or anything is better than Gaddafi. Um,
Mm.
yeah.
And I think that it's something that in the West, you probably hear it too. I hear it a lot.
Mhm.
Um, it's like, well, people can say from the comfort of their nice homes and having never gone to these places or really have any stake in the game, oh, how the Middle East, requires a dictatorship that it has to be ruled with an iron fist. Otherwise, and that really upsets me. I think it's a very bigoted and it comes from this place of naive privilege to say that, it's okay for other people to live their lives under these regimes where, basically the walls have ears and anybody can be disappeared at any point and tortured with no due process. And that there is a very small group of people who are unable to succeed and get jobs and get placements in university just because they're within that inner circle, and everybody else is kind of left to struggle with the rest of their lives, and they'll never have free or fair elections or really a voice. And so I think that it's extremely infuriating to me when people kind of come back with that argument about how these sort of better to have a dictatorship than something else. Nobody wants to live with a terrorist
Right.
regime. Nobody wants to live with, extreme elements or some crazy group running the country. But to kind of say that that's, you know, is better for people than, to live under a dictatorship, I find that to be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. No, and I hear that oftentimes as well. And it just speaks to the ignorance of the person that espouses that idea and their inability to view things from a different perspective. It's very, yeah, that hurts, especially when you say to someone that comes from that region.
Yeah. That you're just supposed to live your life under oppression and and never be able to choose who you want to lead and never be able to reach the top echelons in your university class or in your profession because you don't have the right last name. We have the luxury of not having to experience that in the United States. And so it's very easy to kind of walk around and claim that.
Yeah. You know, I've always, even, during or under the most brutal systems or through, or even under a lot of, or even once when they go through a lot of suffering, I've always, noticed that whether it be, I guess, the Syrians, or the Libyans, or Palestinians, it's when you have conversations with them, a lot of times it feels like uh, whatever it is that they're going through has sort of become their new normal, and there's oftentimes, I guess, joy and happiness that they find even within all of this sort of suffering that they are, I guess, going through. Um, and the like even recently during the summer when I was up in Virginia, I got to meet two people from Sudan that I think you also got to have a conversation with through Tom, our good friend Tom Pritchard. And
Mm.
I do remember talking to one of these people, the woman, I forgot what her name was, but
Aloea?
Aloia, yeah, that's her
Yeah.
name. Yeah, I remember having a conversation with her, and in spite of everything that she went through, she was just genuinely
Mm.
curious in me and just asking all these questions and having a conversation. And I remember even during the end when we were about to wrap things up, the way she shook my hand was just so, like, it was like this, and then with the other hand on top. And I felt so, like, I certainly didn't go through the things that she went through, but there's still, I sense the sense of, I guess, joy and happiness in her that I'm like, this is just very surreal to me how you can still find happiness and
Mm.
joy and. Uh,
Yeah, she's
it's
beautiful. She's wonderful. And it is, and I think it speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. I think that it is, we are inherently optimistic people, um, and that hope is really the key ingredient to survival, is that you have to hope for something better. You have to believe something will change, something will get better, because if you don't, um, how do you wake up every day? How do you get through the day? How do you feed your children? Um, how do you survive? And I think in
mm.
order to survive these unfathomable things, we have to have hope. We have to have hope and a faith that there will be a breakthrough, that it's not going to be like this forever, that somebody will listen, that somebody will care enough to take action.
Do you feel like there's a certain sense of I guess relief that some of the people that you've talked to experience after they share with you intimate or personal details about the things that they had to go through? Do you sense that there may be feeling like some sort of weight has been lifted off of their shoulders, and now, they at least found someone that cares or actually,
Mm.
empathizes with them in a way?
Yeah, I think that, and that's sort of a key part of the reason that of why I've continued to do this work through the years, is that I feel like in telling their story, in being able to write their story, you are giving them some semblance of justice that they are never going to get from the courts or from the, international justice system, that their perpetrators will probably never be held to account for the atrocities that they committed. But at least in telling their story, you're reminding people that they have a voice, that people do care, that what they say matters, because for so long they've been beaten down or made to feel less than, and or their dignity has been stripped away, and they're impoverished, they're begging for food, and to give them that voice, I think is a reminder that they matter. And so you're giving them some sense of justice they wouldn't otherwise see. But I think with that, I know for myself as a journalist, I end up walking away with the weight, not obviously nothing compared to what they've gone through, but you go away with, so in telling their story, I think oftentimes it's also an expectation that something might change overnight. That surely when people know about what is happening, when you put that out in the world in some way, that okay, well, now somebody's going to act, now somebody's going to change something. And 99.9% of times, nothing's going to change, at least not overnight. And so that's the hardest bit, is managing those expectations of being able to sort of explain that um, you'll tell their story, but I'm not a lawmaker. I don't have that kind of power, and all I can do is share. But that's going to be limited in and of itself. And so managing that always leaves me with a big sense of guilt, because it's hard to make change these days. It's hard, I think, and I've observed over my 20-year career in the media, because there is so much noise out there, because when I started, there wasn't social media. You had your, traditional news networks, and then you had your newspapers and some long form magazines. But I mean, of course, now there's just so much out there. It's just this cacophony of whatever you want, you can exist in. And that sort of does dilute some of the stronger messages that are out there. And it does make change harder to come by, because there are so many different angles, messages are confused, people don't know what to believe, and just even accessing the information, even getting to be able to read that or see that, that's going to be so much harder, because there's so much other glossy stuff in the way. And so that has been yeah, that's been, a conversation that I have with myself frequently, about the kind of future trajectory of this work.
Mm. especially your role in it as well, with these new responsibilities are placed on your shoulders, maybe family commitments, maybe other affairs to attend to. It just becomes harder and harder to maybe give the same maybe level of justice to that type of work. Or maybe, I mean, it's harder, but I'm sure it's possible.
No, I mean, I think when I take on a project, I'm always going to give it 100% and do what I can to put it out there.
Mhm.
But it's just overall, I think the struggle is uh is very real.
Yeah.
Just to make people care. I also think, with social media, it's sort of easy to desensitize. I think
Mhm.
it's used to be that, people were very engaged in what was happening around the world. But I think a lot of the times that's gone. And I almost feel like, just as a whole, our society has lost a lot of that, lost a lot of empathy, a lot of moral graciousness. I feel like everybody's ability to attack one another, keyboard warrior style, um, but that's very normalized now. This sort of hate-filled sentiment, I fear, is become very normal in our society. And if we don't have kindness and if we don't have empathy, why do we care what's happening in Darfur? Why do we care what's happening in Burma? Why should we care? What's that got to do with me? Doesn't affect my life. And so I think when that sort of attitude becomes more mainstream, yeah, how do we affect change? Why would anybody care? Why would they want to read an article about Darfur women who have been, horrifically raped and tortured? And if we don't have empathy, then it's very hard to initiate the kind of changes and the kind of support that these people need.
And there's also the attention span that I think is sort of dwindling as well, where people wouldn't even want to, you know, uh, you find these 15-second videos or 10-second videos, and people are just not. People don't even read anymore. They just
Mm,
want something that's quick, um, informative, and also obviously, source plays a role as well. You can't just get anything that's quick and informative. But there's also this idea that, people are just not, as you put it, they just there's lack of empathy, and with social media, especially when you're bombarded with misfortunes all the time,
mm,
it feels so hard to feel, if that makes
mm,
sense.
mm,
And I sense that sometimes with me, just having this device in front of me and all of these events unfolding around the world, all of the pain and suffering, it feels like, oh, I think I should take a step back and just to kind of take a little bit of a break. Um,
mm.
yeah. Um, but yeah, it's just constant exposure can be quite impactful, especially when you're on the ground and seeing that firsthand.
Yeah, and then you see it firsthand, and then it becomes very frustrating why everyone around you doesn't care as much as you do. And I certainly have to have many moments of checking myself and putting my feet back on the earth and remembering, um, the nuances of the world. But
Yeah.
it's hard to see that level of suffering or humans' ability to do such horrible things to other humans and not want to do something about it. And that's been I think the cross I've beared in my life is, I think there's been so many times where I've felt like, I needed to go and, maybe veer off into a different professional path, or, take a position that's going to maybe give me, better, or some sort of steady financial income, especially with a child and all these
Mhm.
things. And at the end of the day, I have to come back, and it kills at me because I can't know these things and not want to do anything about it. Um, so yeah, and with all the challenges that come with that, but at the end of the day, there's something that I want to be able to sleep at night knowing that I didn't turn away from something, and that, my contribution, however small in the world, um, you know, it can matter in a small way. And so I think that for me, that's the biggest lesson,
Mm.
or biggest hope that I have for my daughter, is that she understands the world, she sees the world, and she wants to play whatever part she can to make it better, because I think that is what the world needs. The world doesn't need more influencers. The world doesn't need more gazillionaire CEOs. The world doesn't need um more Hollywood actresses. No offense to anyone out there. I'm being very blunt right now. But the world needs people who want to stand up for the right thing and want to stand with people that need them, because there are so many people out there that need our voice, our support, our care. And we're in a place of privilege, really. We are. We can sleep well at night. We are, for all our problems that we have, and I'm not saying that we don't, but majority of us can go to the grocery store, pick up food,
Right.
live a relatively happy, um, joy-filled life. And for so many people, that's just, I mean, they're living in incredibly, in my recent trip with the Darfurians, I mean, just really dire conditions. There's nothing.
Mhm.
Running water, there's no running water, there's no refrigeration, there's very little food. Everybody's coming down with malaria multiple times a year because there
Oof.
isn't, I mean, something like a mosquito net is a luxury, and just such a small impact. I think that we don't realize how little goes a long way. And I think it's much easier to sort of turn away and go inward and focus on ourselves. But I just know for me, that's just not the way that my DNA is. I'm not able to do that.
Yeah. With the trip you went on to Chad, um, how how long has it been since you've before you went there? How long has it been since you've been to like a conflict torn area or a place with?
A conflict torn area. I guess it was, I mean, I had Raven in 2023. Yeah. So the spring of 2023.
Wow. And whew,
So it's just over a year, I guess, a year and a bit,
yeah.
18 months.
How did that what was that like to be away for a while and then go back to a place of I guess of
Mm.
humanitarian
Well,
crisis?
it really feels like home to me going to these places. I know that sounds a little crazy because it's not my home. But I think because I've worked in conflict zones for a really long time in many parts of the world, it's a place that I do feel relatively comfortable there, which is why I've continued to do the work, because I certainly think if you're absolutely writhing in discomfort, then it's not the profession for you.
Mm.
But I felt very comfortable there. I love meeting new people. I love the experiences. I love having my eyes open to different people, different cultures, different languages, all of that. And um, yeah, for me, I guess, and when I'm not there, I miss it. It tears me up. Um, so going back is, obviously horrific on one hand, but on the other hand, it feels like where I'm meant to be. And so there's a certain settling of everything else, I think, when I'm in these places and just kind of able to do the work that I feel matters, and everything is in its right place.
Yeah. You know, I remember reading a book for one of my classes, an anthropology course on humanitarian aid, wealth, and poverty. and we came across a story in a particular Scandinavian country. I forgot what that country was, which speaks to my performance in the class. I'm just kidding.
Hmm.
I had a,
I'm sure you aced it. I'm sure you were at the top.
no, I think I did okay, but and my professor loves my podcast, so a shout out to Dr. Jordan. Anyways, uh, I remember in one of the books we read, there was a story about these elderly women who sew blankets, and they spend days and long hours and great deal of effort to try to sew these blankets and give them away to um, people who are in need.
Mm.
And they do these things because an anthropologist is studying these women, and the anthropologist says that these women do these things because this keeps them alive. This
Yeah.
whole this process, this from start to finish, the effort that they put into it, it's something that keeps them alive, and that's
Mm.
primarily why they do it. And
Mm.
I wonder if that's something that maybe resonates with you in a way where this work you do, having to go face first into these areas and talk to these people, is that one of the things that kind of sort of keeps you alive in a way? Like it's
It
one of the
does. It
purposes.
does. It does. It's absolutely like it's just it's hard to describe. It's something that I do. I feel it's part of your lifeblood. It's something that um is absolutely a part of you. And that has also made my trajectory in becoming a mom a little bit challenging because on one hand, my baby girl is everything.
Mm,
Um, but I also don't want to lose that part of myself. But I also have to recognize that I'm in a different stage of life where, I can't compete with the 28-year-old war reporters who were childless, who can kind of jump in a plane and go wherever they want, which is something that I used to be able to do.
right.
And I really have to check myself and remind myself that I have to sort of forge my own path in all of this because I can't be that person anymore. But that doesn't mean that I can't do my part. I just have to find a way to do it differently. So I think when you become a mom, you already go through so many. I mean, it's very common to go through sort of these identity crisis, if you will,
Mm,
of not knowing who you are, what you can do anymore. And I think in my case, it's very compounded because my work is overseas and I can't, just pick up and take my child with me to a war zone. That's not going to happen. And so it makes it a little bit harder to solve. And so it's a constant work in progress, but it does remind me of how important this work still is to me. And I think before I had Raven, so many people would say to me, "Oh, you're not going to want to go to a war zone when you have a baby. You're going to want to give that up." And that hasn't been my experience. In fact, it's been very reinforced to me that that is still so much a part of the example that I want to set for my daughter, that I want her to see her mother going to do what she can in the world. Um, and I don't want it to be just a matter of me, one day sitting and telling her about the stories that I used to do. I want it to be something that is an ongoing process, that she can, you know, see for herself in some ways. So that's been a little bit of a struggle, but at
mm,
the end of the day, it's the work is still so important to me because it does feel like it is part of me and part of that lifeblood.
yeah. Is is becoming a mother one of the reasons perhaps you wanted to maybe start a podcast to understand more about you know, how did what is the best way to raise, I guess, a child? And I know there is no perfect recipe. You just
Mm,
gotta be there,
I think
right?
for me, it's been a bit more of a curiosity in the sense that, being in all these places and talking to people from different countries and um, everybody's got, there's so much nuggets of wisdom in everybody's experience. And I think, we're told to do things one way and we can't, you can't eat raw fish, you have to do this way, da, 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 da. And there's just all these sort of set guidelines that nobody really questions, and that's okay. But I think it's important, and I think it's just interesting um, to see how the rest of the world does it, and that the guidelines that we put on ourselves here don't exist, in other places, or how other cultures or tribes see raising children very differently to the way that we do. And I think for me, the goal with it wasn't necessarily to impart advice or to change anybody's ways. It was more, I guess, from this anthropology point of view of just of gaining knowledge and intrigue and insight into how different it is to raise a child in Vietnam versus raising a child in Sudan versus raising
Mm.
a child in India. Because I think there's a lot we can learn, but education wasn't my primary objective. It was more just, yeah, giving an understanding of the way the world works, and sort of in parallel to the work that I do, which is primarily focused on war crimes and civilians.
Yeah. What'd you learn so far from recording and starting this podcast? I see that you've, I think, published maybe 10 or 11 episodes, which is quite a tremendous feat.
Um, I mean, I've enjoyed the experience of talking to different people, reconnecting with people, and meeting new people, and and teaching myself the way it all works. Again, it's not. It is a lot of work, certainly. Um, it's hard to do on your own a little bit, I think, is what I found without kind of a team or a bit of a support system. The
Yeah.
marketing aspect is difficult because obviously you want people to listen, but there is so much noise out there that I'm not sure I figured out how to actually get it to people.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I'll continue it or not beyond this sort of first season, but I've certainly learned a lot and I've really enjoyed it. I think you have to, again, being an independent journalist, being a mom, think about what makes sense with the use of your time, because I have a lot less time than I used to. And as much as I love the podcast, I have to look at it and think, is this make sense for me to continue to devote such a chunk of time away from my child for something that I'm not sure I can get to the people? So that's been a little bit of my struggle.
Yeah. Um, you also recently published a novel. I think your first novel, right? Um,
Yeah, The Dictator's Wife. That's my first fiction, because
fiction,
everything I've done
right?
is nonfiction. Yeah,
Yeah. What was
just
that
gonna
like
turn
to
some light on
transition?
here.
What's that?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm just turning some light on here. The sun is going down, so it's a
Oh,
little dark. Um,
I have my
enjoyed
artificial
that.
light here from the ceiling.
Uh, I really enjoyed that process because it was more initially an experiment. Like I just wanted to play with different type of writing, use the knowledge I had of the Middle East and dictatorships in the world, but kind of play with it in a more creative sense. I think at the time that I was writing it, I was really just yearning for a little bit more creativity in my life.
Mm.
Um, and so it was more just something I didn't really think anyone would ever see. Um, but I mean, I enjoyed the process, but I found it incredibly difficult. I found it so much harder than doing a nonfiction, because nonfiction, the stories are told to you. You've got the memories, you've got the photos, you've got the descriptions all kind of in your head. The effort is just getting it into some sort of readable thing.
Right.
Whereas fiction, yes, you have knowledge and experience, but you have to really craft these characters, and they have to
Mm.
be extremely compelling. You've got to make sure all the twists and turns add up, that you give enough hints, but not too much, that the story makes plausible sense. And sometimes you don't always know where you're going with it, but it was hard. I found it to be an incredibly difficult experience, but I loved it. But yeah, my hat's off to fiction writers. It's not just sitting in a whimsical space and just creating. It's There's so much more to it than that.
And what was your, I guess, the spot where you, or the, I guess, time where you feel like all these ideas are pouring and you feel like you're in the zone of writing something that is, you know, creative and, fictional. um how do you remember that process? I mean, was it the same throughout, or you had to change things? um
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are going to be some days where the everything flows and the ideas flow and you're really into it and you're really in the moment and you're really enjoying it. And there's just going to be days where it feels like such a chore and you're like, oh, I can't, what am I doing? You have to push through those because I think if we're just only going to work when we feel the inspiration to work, we'll never get the work done. And I think part of being a writer is really pushing through those mental blocks to the other
mm,
side. And sometimes I think for me, it was more just this mentality of just get the work on the paper. It doesn't have to be great, doesn't have to be well written. That can all be tweaked and edited, and you can do all that later. Just get the nuts and bolts of it done. So I think even with the stories I write, um, that's the approach I take oftentimes is just kind of get the skeleton there, and that's
mm,
the hardest bit, and the rest can come later.
yeah. And now that, we see a collapse of the Assad regime and a huge transition, do you think you'd be able to? Is there a potential plan of traveling and spending maybe a week or two over there just to see how
No,
things are?
I mean, I'd be there right now if I could, but yeah, I'm looking after my daughter at the moment. My partner is away, and normally when I'm traveling, his mother, who's in upstate New York, she helps us out. She's also away overseas. So right now it's not doable, and we are off to Australia next week. But
Oh,
certainly I think the story is not going away, and it's certainly a big objective of mine to get back there next year and continue to tell the story. Sometimes I think it's really hard to not be there in the kind of the heat of the moment, and I just have to remember where I'm at in life,
mhm.
um, and and just remember that these stories, they continue to evolve and change, and um, it's all in good time.
Yeah. I don't think I ever asked you this question, Holly, but what is your way of trying to decompress? Like, is there something you can share? Like, being bombarded with a lot of, or maybe willingly, obviously choosing to be, to amplify people's voices and write their stories, and oftentimes they're fraught with so much pain and just tremendous suffering. I mean, what's your way of trying to
Mm.
maybe decompress a little bit?
I don't know that I have a specific way of that. Obviously, you want to be surrounded by family and creature comforts. And I mean, I work out a lot. Running is a big part of my life. Um, so those things are all really important to me to let off steam. But I think for me, it's just, yeah, it's continuing to get the story out. I think if I was just to stop, that would probably bother me more than trying to figure out ways of decompressing. So I think I don't have a set specific way of it, but I think I feel very clear about why I do the work and why I'm on that particular mission.
Yeah. And what would be your advice to Raven if she at some point decided to pursue a similar line of work?
Um, I really don't know where we're going to be in 20 years' time, just because with the way that technology is evolving, with AI, with all these things, it's hard for me to even imagine the world in 20 years.
Yeah.
Um, but I would certainly, you know, encourage or with her with whatever she wanted to do. Um, I think journalism, in and of itself can be a little bit tough, and I don't know about the appetite for foreign journalism, but um, but yeah, anything in the humanitarian space, anything where I feel like you can make the lives of people better. I mean, my hope for her is, I think that's what I strive for. Those values are really important to me and to our family. And um, yeah, I think I'll tell her to follow her heart with a little bit of head.
I guess that's one way of wrapping up our conversation. Thank you, Holly, for this wonderful opportunity. I'm glad we got to do this a second time. This was great.
Absolutely. Thank you for your support in my work and your interest and friendship. And you're doing amazing work. And I'm very honored to be a part of it.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine, Holly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.